The mockery begins. The void of space stretched endlessly, silent and dark, except for the massive alien fleet that surrounded a lone human warship. Their sleek, advanced vessels gleamed under distant starlight, their curved hulls reflecting a faint, eerie glow. They moved in perfect formation, like predators circling a wounded prey. At the center of this deadly ring was the Iron Howl, an old and rusting Terran battleship. Its once mighty armor was scratched and dented, its paint faded from time and battle scars. To the Tselveri Empire, this ship was nothing more than a joke. Aboard the Tselveri command vessel, High Commander Vectar sneered. His emerald green skin glowed under the control room's dim lights, his sharp fangs exposed in a cruel grin. The Tselveri were one of the most powerful species in the galaxy, and their warships were considered unstoppable. Yet, here stood this ancient human relic, daring to face them. Vectar tapped a clawed finger against the armrest of his command chair. He turned to his second-in-command, Commander Yiln. "This is their resistance," Vectar scoffed. "This thing. This Terran garbage." Yiln chuckled. "Our scans confirm it, Commander. The ship is old technology, outdated weapons, failing energy reserves. The humans have sent a corpse to fight a war." Vectar laughed. Mocking humans was always entertaining. The Tselveri had crushed countless civilizations, and humanity was just another insect beneath their boots. "Open a channel to the Terran ship," Vectar commanded. A moment later, the holoscreen flickered, and the bridge of the Iron Howl appeared. In the center of the screen sat Captain Darius Kane. He was old, his hair silver with streaks of black, his face marked by deep battle scars. But his blue eyes were calm, sharp, and unwavering. He wore a simple military jacket, the old Terran insignia barely visible on his shoulder. Vectar smirked. "Terran, your ship is an insult. It belongs in a scrapyard, not a battlefield." Kane said nothing. He simply leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. His expression was unreadable. Vectar continued, enjoying himself. "Surrender now, and I may allow your crew to live. Refuse, and I will tear your ship apart molecule by molecule." The Tselveri officers laughed. It was a game to them, watching humans squirm before their execution. But Kane did not squirm. He did not blink. Instead, he smiled. A slow, knowing, almost amused smile. For the first time, Vectar's amusement faded. He narrowed his reptilian eyes. "What is so funny, human?" Kane exhaled, shifting slightly in his chair. His voice was calm, steady, and dangerously quiet. "You don't know, do you?" Kane said. Vectar frowned. "Know what?" Kane's smile widened. His fingers drummed against the console in a rhythmic pattern. Thump, thump, thump. A deep, metallic groan echoed through the Iron Howl's hull, a sound like an old beast stretching its limbs after centuries of slumber. Vectar turned to Yiln. "What was that?" Yiln checked the data. His eyes widened. "Sir, something is changing on the human ship. Energy levels spiking." Vectar's eyes flicked back to Kane. The human captain was still smiling. Kane leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low whisper. "You made one mistake, Tselveri." He paused. "You assumed this ship was asleep." The transmission cut off. Silence filled the Tselveri command deck. Then the Iron Howl began to move. The ancient battleship's engines flickered to life, glowing with a deep blue fire. Its hull groaned and stretched, like an awakening predator. The Tselveri officers stiffened. "Sir, something is happening." A sound tore through space, a deep, rumbling roar, like the voice of an ancient beast waking from its grave. The Iron Howl was not a corpse. It was a sleeping monster, and it had just opened its eyes. The sleeping beast awakens. The Tselveri warships floated in tight formation, their sleek silver hulls gleaming under the cold glow of distant stars. Every alien officer on the command bridge of Vectar's flagship, the Veilshan, had expected this to be nothing more than a brief extermination. They had not prepared for what happened next. The Iron Howl, the Terran corpse they had mocked, was no longer lifeless. It was awakening. The first signs of doom. The Selvari fleet's advanced scanners had labeled the human battleship outdated, its energy readings barely above emergency levels. Now, the readings were skyrocketing. "Commander," a Selvari officer shouted from the sensor station, his voice laced with panic. "The human ship. Its power levels are increasing exponentially." Vectar's brow furrowed, his amusement gone. "That's impossible. It's a derelict. A floating relic." The officer hesitated, his claws twitching over his console. "Sir, not anymore." The Iron Howl shuddered, its rusted hull groaning, but it was not a sound of collapse. It was a sound of shedding age, of rebirth. Its thrusters, once dim, flared to life in an unnatural blue-white blaze. Its weapon systems, marked as inactive, flickered on one by one. Its shields, once non-existent, roared to full strength in an instant. The ship's systems were rebooting, not struggling, but coming alive with terrifying speed. For the first time, silence fell on the Selvari bridge. This was not how things were supposed to go. "What are we looking at?" Vectar stood from his throne-like command chair, his claws gripping the armrests. He turned to Yiln, who was rapidly running calculations with a grim look on his reptilian face. "Tell me what's happening," Vectar demanded. Yiln swallowed. "Sir, the ship's power readings, they'd match pre-war Terran dreadnoughts." Vectar's eyes narrowed. "Pre-war? You mean the war that wiped out entire empires?" "Yes, sir," Yiln confirmed, his voice quieter now. "The war humanity fought when they were still monsters. A ship not of this era. The Iron Howl had been built in an age of desperation, a time when humanity had been a cornered species, fighting against extinction. In those days, the Terrans did not build ships to outmatch their enemies. They built ships to terrify them, ships that fought without mercy, ships that never surrendered, ships that did not die until they had slaughtered everything around them. The Iron Howl was one of the last of its kind, and it had just come back to life. The roar that shook the stars. Then, the sound came. A deep, monstrous roar, vibrating through space itself. Not the sound of an engine. Not the sound of weapons firing. Not even the sound of an explosion. This was something else. It was a declaration, a battle cry from a machine that had waited too long to taste war again. That Selvari officers flinched, their ears flattening against their skulls. Some stumbled backward, their instincts screaming danger. Even Vectar felt his blood run cold. Ships were not supposed to sound like that. Ships did not roar. "Commander, they're moving." The Selvari fleet had expected an easy execution. Their ships were already in attack formation, weapons locked onto the Iron Howl. But the human warship did not move like a relic. It lunged forward, faster than it should have been able to. For a split second, Vectar's mind refused to process what he was seeing. One moment, the Iron Howl had been drifting, a lifeless hunk of metal. The next, it had vanished from its position, streaking toward the nearest Selvari warship like a hunter pouncing on prey. The Selvari ship, the Veil Rock, had no time to react. Its shields were still at full power. Its weapons were locked onto the Terran battleship. It didn't matter. A weapon long forgotten. For decades, modern alien warships had evolved around energy weapons, lasers, plasma bolts, and quantum disintegrators, fast, precise, and efficient. But the Iron Howl was from a different time. It did not fire plasma. It did not fire lasers. It fired something older, something brutal, something unstoppable. "Sir, they fired Kai and ETSC weapons." The Iron Howl's railguns came online, massive, ancient cannons that fired pure metal slugs at relativistic speeds. It wasn't light. It wasn't energy. It was raw, merciless physics, and nothing in modern space warfare was designed to stop it. The first kill. The Valoroc's shields were designed for energy weapons. They did nothing against a slug of tungsten traveling at near light speed. That Selvari ship didn't explode. It was ripped in half. One moment, it had been an untouched warship, shielded and battle-ready. The next, it was two separate chunks of metal drifting in opposite directions, split cleanly down the middle like a fruit cut by a blade. For a second, there was absolute silence. Then the shockwave hit. The sheer force of impact sent debris hurling through space, knocking nearby ships off course. The battlefield was now deadly quiet. Fear creeps in. On that Selvari bridge, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Vector stared at the wreckage, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. An ancient human warship had just obliterated one of his fleet's finest vessels with a single shot. Yilm's voice was barely above a whisper. "Sir, that was just one gun." A new reality. The Iron Howl wasn't retreating. It wasn't running. It had just claimed its first kill, and now it was aiming for the next target. Vector clenched his fists, his claws digging into his palm. His arrogance was gone. Now he was afraid. For the first time in his career, he realized his fleet might not win this battle. Because this was not a normal Terran warship. This was something far worse. This was a monster from humanity's darkest era. And it had just woken up. The ghost of war. The battlefield was silent. The wreckage of that Selvari warship, Valoroc, floated lifelessly in space. Its shattered hull split cleanly in two. The burning debris cast an eerie glow over the surrounding fleet, a grim warning to all who had doubted the power of the Iron Howl. That Selvari had expected an easy kill. Instead, they had awoken something ancient. And now, it was hunting them. "Commander, we have a problem." The bridge of the Valshan, High Commander Vector's flagship, was in chaos. Officers hissed and shouted over one another, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Vector himself stood frozen, his reptilian eyes locked onto the wreckage outside. It wasn't possible. It shouldn't have been possible. One moment, his fleet had surrounded a dying Terran relic. The next, that relic had become a nightmare. His mind refused to accept it, but the truth was undeniable. The Iron Howl was no crippled museum piece. It was a ghost of humanity's deadliest era. And now, it was awake. "Commander," Yilm's voice snapped him back to reality. The second-in-command's usual calm demeanor was cracking under the weight of the moment. "What?" Vector snarled. Yilm swallowed hard, his clawed fingers trembling as they typed commands into his console. "Sir, it's moving again. A predator in the dark." The Iron Howl disappeared. One moment it was there, looming over the wreckage of its first kill. The next, it vanished into the darkness of space, slipping through the Selvari formation like a shadow of death. Vector's eyes widened. Where did it go? Yilm's scanners struggled to keep up. "Sir, its thrusters cut out completely. It's using its own momentum to move without detection." Vector snarled, his claws digging into the armrests of his command chair. "They're ghosting us." Costing. An ancient human war tactic. It was one of the reasons humanity had survived for so long against superior alien forces. They fought like monsters in the dark. They vanished when you expected them to fight head-on. And when you thought they had fled, they struck from the shadows. "Find them." Vector roared. "Scan every sector. They can't have gone far." But deep down, he knew the truth. If a Terran battleship didn't want to be found, you wouldn't find it. The echo of forgotten war. The Selvari warships adjusted their formation, moving into a defensive spread, scanning every inch of space. Their weapons were ready, their shields at full power. But the crew of the Valshan was growing nervous. For the first time in their military careers, they were hunting something they couldn't see. Something that shouldn't exist. Then, a whisper came through the comms. A transmission. It wasn't Selvari. It wasn't coming from their fleet. It was coming from the void. A deep, ancient human voice, crackling through the silence like a ghostly presence. It was Cain. You called this ship a relic. You thought we were weak. You made one mistake. You forgot what humanity used to be. Static filled the comms. Then, a final whisper. You should have left us in the grave. Hell breaks loose. The iron howl struck like a demon from the abyss. Without warning, 2 Selvari warships exploded simultaneously, ripped apart by railgun fire so fast their shields never even registered the impact. That Selvari fleet panicked. Ships swerved wildly, breaking formation, their captains desperately trying to locate their attacker. But the iron howl wasn't in just one place. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. Like a phantom, it weaved through the battlefield, dodging incoming fire with an agility no Selvari ship could match. Its turrets roared, spitting out kinetic rounds the size of fighter ships, tearing through enemy vessels like paper. Every shot hit. Every shot killed. And that Selvari fleet was falling apart. Fear spreads like fire. Vectar watched, helpless, as his once mighty armada was reduced to burning wreckage. His crew looked at him, waiting for orders. For the first time, he had none. This wasn't war. This was annihilation. The iron howl was not fighting for survival. It was delivering punishment. And Vectar knew it wasn't done yet. The hunter and the prey. Cain sat in his chair, watching the battle unfold. His crew moved with calm precision, executing his commands without hesitation. This was not their first battle, and it would not be their last. A young officer turned to him. "Sir, enemy flagship identified." "Orders." Cain didn't blink. "Lock weapons. Bring us in close." The officer hesitated. "Close, sir." Cain nodded, a cold smile forming. "I want to see their eyes when we end them." The end of arrogance. The iron howl turned toward the Veilshan, its massive guns locking onto Vectar's flagship. Vectar saw it. He saw the glowing blue thrusters, the massive, ancient hull scarred from wars older than his own species. He saw the beast of humanity's past, staring him down like a predator about to strike the final blow. He had once mocked this ship. Now, he feared it. For the first time in his life, High Commander Vectar gave the order he swore he never would. Retreat. The Selvari fleet turned tail and fled. But the iron howl did not chase them. It let them run. Because it knew the truth. That Selvari would spread the story. They would tell the galaxy what had happened here today. And next time, no one would dare mock a Terran warship again. The fear spreads. The battlefield was no longer a battlefield. It was a graveyard. The wreckage of Selvari warships drifted lifelessly through space, their shattered hulls testaments to the terror they had just faced. Fires still burned in the vacuum, flickering against the darkness like the last breaths of dying warriors. Where once had been an invincible armada, now remained only ruins. And at the center of it all, untouched, the iron howl loomed like a god of war. The flight of the fallen. High Commander Vectar had never retreated in his life. To retreat was dishonor. To retreat was cowardice. Yet here he was, giving the order to flee. His command ship, the Veilshan, led the few surviving Selvari vessels in a desperate escape burn, their engines blazing as they tore through the void. The fleet's once perfect formation had shattered, captains abandoning their posts in panic. "Faster!" Vectar barked, his sharp teeth clenched in fury. "Get us into hyper-jump range. Now." Yiln, his second-in-command, hesitated before responding. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Sir, it's not following us." "The hunter stands still." Vectar froze. He turned to the main viewing screen, expecting to see the iron howl closing in for the final strike. But it wasn't. The human battleship wasn't moving. It simply hovered in space, surrounded by the burning wreckage of the Selvari dead. Waiting. Watching. It wasn't chasing them. Because it didn't need to. The fear was already inside them. Vektar's claws dug into his command chair, his breathing shallow, uneven. His warriors sat in stunned silence, their faces pale with horror. They had never seen a Terran warship fight like this. They had never seen humans fight like this. What kind of creature lets its prey run? What kind of beast does not finish the hunt? And then the truth hit him like a blade to the chest. It was never about the battle. The Iron Howl had already won, and by letting them escape, it had ensured something far worse than death. It had ensured the spread of fear. The legend begins. Deep inside the Iron Howl, Captain Darius Kane watched as the enemy ships disappeared into the void. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His icy blue eyes were unreadable, his expression calm. A younger officer, Lieutenant Aria Vasquez, spoke up hesitantly. "Sir, should we pursue?" Kane didn't answer immediately. His fingers tapped lightly against the metal armrest of his chair. Thump, thump, thump. Then, with a slow shake of his head, he said, "No." Aria frowned. "But they're getting away." Kane turned his gaze toward the flickering wreckage outside. His voice was quiet but certain. "They won't forget what happened here today." His senior weapons officer, Garrick, grinned from his station. "We let 'em live so they can tell the others." Ha! Kane's smirk was barely visible. Exactly. Because Kane knew this was bigger than just one battle. This was about sending a message, a whisper in the dark. The Selvari Empire was one of the strongest in the galaxy, but they weren't the only ones watching. Somewhere, on distant outposts and hidden observation posts, other empires had been listening. Other warlords, other commanders, other rulers. And now, the whispers had begun. They would hear about what happened. They would speak the name Iron Howl, and they would fear it. The weight of survival. Deep inside the Veilshan, High Commander Vektar stood alone in his private quarters, staring at his reflection in the polished metal wall. For the first time in decades, he felt powerless. For the first time in his career, he had been bested not just in battle, but in fear. His mind replayed the events over and over. The roar of the Terran warship, the railguns that tore through his fleet like paper. The voice of Captain Kane, cold and calm, as if the battle had already been decided before it even began. His claws twitched involuntarily. This couldn't happen again. He wouldn't allow it. The Empire's reaction. The surviving Selvari fleet arrived at their homeworld in disgrace. Vektar stood before the High Council, the ruling body of the Selvari Empire, their glowing eyes judging him from their towering thrones. "You lost to a human warship," one of the elders sneered. Vektar clenched his fists but said nothing. Another counselor leaned forward, her voice sharp. "Explain how an outdated Terran battleship destroyed an entire fleet." Vektar took a slow breath. His pride burned, but he spoke the truth. That was no ordinary ship. His voice was low, but deadly serious. That was a relic from humanity's forgotten past. One of the elders scoffed. "A ghost story." Vektar's eyes darkened. "A ghost that killed half our fleet." Silence fell over the chamber. The council exchanged worried glances. Then one of them spoke. "If this ship is truly what you claim it to be, then we must act." Another nodded. "We must prepare for war." And Vektar, despite everything, smiled. Not because he wanted war, but because he knew one thing with absolute certainty. War was already coming. Meanwhile, aboard the Iron Howl, Captain Kane sat in his quarters, a small glass of whiskey in his hand. He took a slow sip, staring at a faded photograph on the wall. It was old, the edges worn. It showed a different time, a time when humanity was still feared, when war was all they knew. The younger officers thought this was just another battle. They were wrong. This was the beginning of something much larger. Because now, the entire galaxy would know. Humanity's monsters were awake once more. And soon, they would come knocking. No mercy for the arrogant. The galaxy had changed. The battle between the Iron Howl and the Xelvari fleet was no longer just a skirmish in deep space. It had become a message, a warning. And now, the galaxy listened. The ashes of defeat. The surviving Xelvari ships drifted into their home system, their once mighty fleet reduced to half of what it had been. Space stations and orbital defenses tracked their return with silent judgment, their cold scanners recording the wreckage that clung to the warships like scars of failure. Vector stood on the command deck of the Veilshan, his golden command cape stained with soot from battle, his claws twitching in barely contained rage. The fleet's return should have been a victory march. Instead, it was a funeral procession. A moment later, his comms console flared to life. A single voice echoed through the room. "Commander Vector, the High Council summons you." Immediately, a council divided. The Xelvari High Council was composed of 7 of the oldest, most cunning warlords in the Empire. They were not pleased. Vector knelt before them, clenching his jaw, waiting for the inevitable judgment. "This is a disgrace." The first elder's voice was filled with cold fury. The great Vector, slayer of Korak fleets, humbled by a single Terran warship. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Some looked at him with disgust. Others, with fear. Because they knew the truth, this wasn't just Vector's failure. This was a warning to them all. "We cannot let this stand," another counselor growled. "The other species are watching. If we appear weak, the balance of power shifts." Another counselor, her golden eyes sharp with intelligence, leaned forward. "What do we know about this ship?" Vector stood. His voice, though laced with bitterness, was steady. "It is not an ordinary warship," he said. "It is a relic from humanity's darkest era. An era before peace treaties, before diplomacy." The counselor sneered. "A relic? A forgotten piece of metal nearly destroyed half your fleet." Vector's eyes burned with anger. "That relic fights with technology our modern fleets are not prepared for." He turned, scanning the chamber. "This is not a war we are ready for." The council fell into dead silence. Then, the eldest among them, his skin wrinkled like an old battle-worn map, spoke. "Then we must prepare." A single command was given. "Call the warlords. We go to war." Meanwhile, the Iron Howl drifted silently in the dark. Its hull scarred from past battles, its presence undeniable, its reputation growing like wildfire. Inside the warship's command center, Captain Kane watched the stars with a quiet, knowing stare. He had expected this. One battle was never enough. Now, the Xelvari would come in force. Kane leaned back, rolling a small metal cylinder between his fingers. It was an old dog tag, scratched from age, but the name on it was still visible. Commander Jonas Halst. Terra's hammer. Kane exhaled. Jonas had been his mentor, long before humanity had laid down its arms, long before the Terran war machine had been put to rest. And now, that machine was waking up again. His second in command, Lieutenant Vasquez, approached cautiously. "Sir, we intercepted transmissions." She handed him a datapad. The screen flickered with intercepted Xelvari messages. Kane scanned the text, his lips curled into a knowing smirk. "They're calling the warlords," Vasquez said, shaking her head. "They're bringing everything." Kane exhaled through his nose, setting the datapad aside. "They should have left us alone." Vasquez frowned. "What do we do?" Kane looked at the holographic map of the Xelvari home system. He tapped a single point on the map, the capital. "We take the fight to them." Xelvari Prime, the heart of the Empire. The Xelvari homeworld was a fortress of unimaginable scale. Massive orbital shipyards built warships the size of small moons. The planet's defense grid was the strongest in the sector. No enemy had ever reached it. But no enemy had ever been human. In the shadows, Xelvari politicians whispered among themselves. Fear spread like a disease. The battle against the Iron Howl was supposed to be a display of dominance. Instead, it had proven something terrifying. The humans were not broken. They were waiting. And now, they were coming. The howl of war. In the depths of space, the Iron Howl's engines fired to life. This was not a retreat. This was a hunt. As the warship moved forward, its crew prepared for the next battle. Weapons systems activated. Shields fortified. Thrusters burned brighter than they had in decades. Kane stood before his bridge crew, voice calm but filled with the weight of inevitable war. "They think we'll hide," he said. "They think we'll wait for them to come." His fingers clenched into a fist. "They're wrong." The Iron Howl turned toward the heart of the Selvari Empire. It wasn't running. It wasn't hiding. It was going to war. And this time, there would be no mercy. No mercy for the arrogant. The stars had always been silent witnesses to war. They had watched civilizations rise and fall, empires burn and fade, and warriors clash in the void, only to be forgotten with time. But tonight, the stars would bear witness to something else, something that had not been seen in centuries. The wrath of an unchained human warship. The march to Selvari Prime. The Iron Howl moved like a ghost through the void, its ancient hull reflecting nothing, its presence like a whisper in the dark. Inside, the crew worked with silent precision, their expressions focused, their movements calm but charged with purpose. The warship had a mission now, and there would be no mercy. "We are alone." Lieutenant Vasquez stood at her station, scanning the void ahead. "The Selvari fleet is gathering at their homeworld," she said. "They're pulling in every warship they have." Kane exhaled slowly. Expected. Vasquez hesitated before adding, "We are alone, sir." Kane turned to her, one eyebrow raised. Vasquez shifted, uncomfortable. "I mean, normally, in a war, we'd have allies. We'd have fleets backing us up." Kane looked at the holographic display of the Selvari home system, its defensive fleet growing larger by the hour. Then he leaned back, expression unreadable. "We don't need allies. The High Council prepares." On Selvari Prime, the High Council stood before their planetary defense grid, watching the stars. They had assembled their greatest generals, their strongest warriors, their most advanced warships. Their fleet now numbered over 300 vessels, spread in a defensive formation around their capital. This was the greatest military force ever gathered in the Empire's history, and it had been assembled to destroy one ship, one human warship, a relic, a ghost, a nightmare. They won't come alone. Vector stood in the war chamber, his hands resting on the control console. "The humans are cunning," he said. "They will not come alone." A younger warlord snorted. "A Terran fleet, perhaps." Vector's eyes narrowed. "No, I don't think they have a fleet." The room fell silent. A counselor scoffed. "Then why are we even here?" Vector's jaw tightened. "Because we don't need to fear their fleet." He turned toward the massive planetary defense screens, where the hologram of the Iron Howl flickered. "We need to fear that ship. The hunt begins." Kane's eyes remained locked on the target. The Selvari homeworld, a fortress of defensive turrets, planetary shields, and battle-ready warships. A lesser man might have hesitated. But Kane was not a lesser man. He was a warhound of the old era, and tonight, he would remind the Selvari why humanity had once been feared. He turned to his officers. "All systems online." A confirmation of "Yes, sir." "Full stealth engage." "Yes, sir." Kane nodded. Then he spoke 2 words. "Drop cloak." Terror in the heavens. In an instant, the Iron Howl revealed itself. A dark shadow materialized from the void, like a nightmare given form. For the first time, Selvari Prime scanners detected the ship. A chorus of alarms erupted across the planet, sirens wailing, commanders shouting orders in panic. The war fleet, which had been waiting for an armada, instead found themselves face to face with a single warship. But they knew what that single warship had already done, and they were afraid. The beast awakens. Aboard the Iron Howl, Kane's voice was calm as he issued his next command. Fire at will. The ship shuddered as its main cannons roared to life, sending kinetic rounds the size of buildings screaming through the battlefield. They weren't energy weapons. The Selvari had designed their shields against energy attacks. These were pure mass, pure destruction, moving at impossible speeds. And when they hit, the first Selvari warship did not explode. It simply ceased to exist. The first kill. The Valkan, a Selvari dreadnought, had been positioned at the forefront of the defensive formation. It had full shields, thick armor, and hundreds of gunners at the ready. None of it mattered. A single kinetic round from the Iron Howl tore through its hull, splitting the ship in half in less than a second. One moment, it was a warship. The next, it was debris. The fleet panicked. A fleet in chaos. Fire. Fire everything. Selvari warships unleashed hell, their energy weapons cutting through the void, trying to annihilate the human warship before it tore through them all. The Iron Howl moved like a predator, weaving through fire, dodging impossibly fast, its ancient but powerful thrusters burning like the breath of a beast. And then it struck again. Another railgun blast. Another Selvari warship, erased from existence. Then another. Then another. And another. The Selvari defense fleet, the greatest armada ever assembled, was being ripped apart by a single ship. The end of Selvari pride. Vektar watched in horror. This was not a battle. This was annihilation. Every tactic they had trained for, every strategy, every weapon, every fleet formation, meant nothing. The Iron Howl fought like no warship they had ever seen, because it wasn't fighting like a modern ship. It was fighting like a weapon from the past. A past where humanity had been at war with extinction itself, where they had built monsters instead of warships, where they had forgotten the meaning of surrender. The final order. Kane stood unshaken in the center of his bridge. A deep breath. A simple command. Target the capital city. A pause. Then an officer spoke, voice steady. Target locked, Captain. Kane's voice remained calm, controlled. Fire. The Iron Howl roars one last time. A single railgun round fired. It tore through the atmosphere of Selvari Prime, moving so fast it left a burning hole in the sky. And when it hit the capital city, it did not explode. It simply went through everything. A straight line of devastation, a wound carved into the heart of an empire. The Selvari stared in silence. And at that moment, they understood. The war was already over. Because the humans, they had never forgotten how to win. The legend reborn. The galaxy would never be the same again. For centuries, the Selvari Empire had stood unchallenged, ruling with absolute power, their fleets crushing any species that dared oppose them. But now their homeworld, Selvari Prime, lay in ruins, scared by a single Terran warship. The Iron Howl had not just defeated their fleet, it had rewritten history. The silence of defeat. The capital city of Selvari Prime had once been a marvel of power and arrogance. Towering spires of metal and glass had stretched into the sky, symbols of their empire's undisputed dominance. Now, a single black scar ran through the heart of the metropolis, a straight, clean wound carved into its foundation by the Iron Howl's final railgun shot. No explosions, no shockwaves, just a silent, undeniable truth. The war was over, and that Selvari had lost. The Council faces the truth. In the deepest chambers of the High Council, the remaining leaders of the Selvari Empire stood in stunned silence. They had prepared for a battle. They had summoned warlords, assembled the mightiest fleet in their history, but they had never expected this. One ship, one captain, one message written in blood and ruin. One of the elder counselors finally spoke. his voice weak. We must retaliate." A sharp laugh cut through the chamber. It was Vectar. The High Commander had not spoken since the battle ended. He stood at the center of the room, his battle-worn armor still stained with the failure of his fleet, his face twisted into something between amusement and despair. "Retaliate," he said softly, shaking his head. "You don't understand, do you?" The counselors glared. "Explain yourself." Vectar's voice was calm, but his words dripped with a terrible truth. "You're thinking like rulers," he said, "like kings sitting on thrones." He stepped closer, his golden eyes burning with something they had never seen before. Fear. "We were never at war." The council chambers fell dead silent. Vectar's voice dropped to a whisper. "This was never a battle for power. It was never about territory." He turned his gaze toward the holographic display of the Iron Howl, a single ship floating in the darkness, motionless, untouched, waiting. This was a warning. A cold realization settled over the room. A realization more terrifying than any war. The Terrans had chosen to let them live. The Iron Howl could have wiped their capital off the map. It could have continued its assault until not a single Xelvari remained. But it didn't. Because the war was already won. Without firing another shot. Aboard the Iron Howl, Captain Kane sat in silence, staring out into the void. The battle was over. Xelvari Prime was in ruins. The galaxy now knew the truth. Humanity was not weak, not broken, not forgotten. They had simply been waiting. And now, the waiting was over. Lieutenant Vasquez approached cautiously. "Sir, transmission from the Xelvari High Council." Kane didn't move. "What do they want?" Vasquez's fingers hesitated over the console. "They want terms." Kane closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. So, the Xelvari had learned. They weren't asking for surrender. They weren't demanding revenge. They were asking for terms. That meant only one thing. They had accepted their defeat. Kane finally opened his eyes, his gaze like steel. "Open the channel." The conversation that changed the galaxy. The holographic display flickered, and before him stood the full Xelvari High Council. They looked pale, shaken, the weight of their loss etched into their very bones. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, the eldest counselor lowered his head. What are your demands?" Kane's voice was steady. "No demands, just a warning." The counselors exchanged uneasy glances. Kane leaned forward, his expression calm but unyielding. "You thought we were weak. You thought we had faded." He let the words linger. "But we were never gone." His next words were spoken slowly, each one a dagger into the heart of Xelvari arrogance. "If you ever threaten humanity again, we will not stop at a warning." Silence. The counselors visibly flinched. And Kane knew, in that moment, that the war was truly over. That Xelvari were many things. But they were not fools. They understood what he meant. There would be no second battle. Because there would be no second chance. The Iron Howl departs. The warship turned away from Xelvari Prime, leaving the ruins of its victory behind. The Xelvari would rebuild. They would whisper of this day for generations. But they would never forget, because the legend of the Iron Howl had been reborn. And now, the entire galaxy knew. Humanity was no longer hiding. They were watching, waiting, and if pushed too far, they would burn the stars themselves. Epilogue. The beginning of something greater. Somewhere, in the farthest reaches of the galaxy, a message was sent. Not from the Xelvari, but from another empire. An empire that had been watching. A council of beings, unknown to the humans, sat in darkness, listening to the transmission. One of them, a shadowed figure with 6 glowing eyes, leaned forward. "So," it said in a voice like a shifting tide, "the humans have returned." Another figure, taller, broader, nodded. "Yes." Silence stretched between them. Then, A quiet chuckle. Good. The darkness swallowed the transmission, and the galaxy shifted once more. The iron howl had begun something far greater than a battle. It had woken up the past, and soon humanity would realize they were not the only ghosts in the dark.